the night tradition finally fought back. Tradition is often described as fragile, something easily broken by time and change. But on one unforgettable night, tradition proved it could do more than survive. It could resist, it could answer, and it could fight back. The restaurant stood at the center of a district racing toward reinvention. Old streets were stripped of character, replaced by polished concepts designed to feel timeless but mean nothing. Menus were rewritten to appeal to everyone and belong to no one. Heritage was celebrated in language, then erased in practice. For years, tradition watched quietly as the world moved on without it, until it didn't. To understand why this night mattered, we must look at the chef who refused to let tradition fade politely. He was not loud. He did not argue in public. He simply cooked the way he had been taught, without shortcuts, without updates, without apology. His dishes carried history not as reference, but as continuation. And in a city that preferred symbols to substance, that continuity became inconvenient. Pressure arrived steadily. Advisors urged modernization. Critics suggested reinterpretation. Investors promised survival in exchange for flexibility. The chef declined them all, not out of nostalgia, but out of responsibility. He believed tradition was not a style to be refreshed. It was a promise to be kept. The tension escalated when a restaurant was selected to host a high-profile cultural event celebrating the future of heritage. The irony was unmistakable. A place that refused to adapt was now expected to perform its past for an audience eager to package it. The chef accepted the invitation, but not for the reasons anyone expected. On the night of the event, the dining room filled with officials, tastemakers, and cultural leaders. Cameras hovered. Speeches were prepared. The menu was assumed to be symbolic, gentle, inoffensive, something that honored tradition without insisting on it. What arrived instead would do the opposite, because that night, tradition did not ask to be admired. It demanded to be taken seriously. And the confrontation that followed would reveal whether tradition was truly welcome in the modern world, or only tolerated as long as it stayed quiet. From the first course, it was clear something was wrong, or rather, something was different. The food did not soften itself in the room. It did not explain its lineage or adjust its edges to meet modern expectations. Flavors arrived sharp, uncompromising, anchored in methods most kitchens had abandoned decades ago. There was no translation, no bridge built for comfort. Guests shifted in their seats. Some smiled politely, unsure how to respond. Others frowned, surprised by the intensity. A few leaned forward, recognition flickering across their faces. The dishes carried weight, of labor, of time, of choices that could not be rushed. This was not heritage presented as memory. It was heritage insisting on presence. Whispers moved through the dining room. This wasn't what they expected. The menu felt confrontational, almost defiant. Advisors glanced at one another. Officials paused mid-conversation. Cameras kept rolling, sensing tension, but not understanding it. In the kitchen, the chef remained steady. He had planned this night carefully, not as a protest, but as a line drawn clearly. If tradition was going to be invited into the future, it would arrive whole, or not at all. He would not dilute it to make it agreeable. By the third course, discomfort had replaced ceremony. A cultural leader leaned back and remarked that the menu felt unnecessarily rigid. Another suggested aloud that heritage should evolve to remain relevant. The words floated through the room, heavy with assumption. The chef heard them. He stepped out of the kitchen for the first time that evening and addressed the room, not with a speech, but with a single explanation. Tradition doesn't evolve by being reshaped to fit trends, he said calmly. It evolves by being practiced until the world catches up. Silence followed. The statement landed not as provocation, but as truth many were unprepared to face. The event was no longer a celebration. It had become a confrontation between a world that wanted tradition curated and a kitchen that insisted tradition still had teeth. The night was far from over, and as the courses continued, it became clear that this was not just a meal. It was a challenge, one that would force everyone in the room to decide whether they believed tradition was a costume or a living force capable of pushing back. The conflict had been set, and tradition was no longer willing to stay quiet. The tension thickened with every plate cleared. Conversation slowed, then fractured. Some guests leaned into the experience, tasting with renewed focus. Others withdrew, unsettled by a meal that refused to reassure them. The room had divided, not loudly, but unmistakably, between those willing to meet tradition where it stood and those who wanted it reshaped into something easier to applaud. Midway through the service, an official stood and raised a concern. They spoke carefully. Choosing words meant to sound respectful. They questioned whether such rigidity risked alienating the very future tradition hoped to reach. They suggested that preservation required adaptation, compromise, and accessibility. Heads nodded, pens moved, cameras adjusted. The chef listened without interruption. Then he responded, not with defense, but with context. He spoke of the hands that taught him, of techniques that required years to feel, not weeks to learn, of dishes that only made sense when cooked for people who understood waiting. He explained that accessibility without depth was not preservation. It was replacement. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence fell heavier. The next course arrived without warning. It was the most demanding dish on the menu, one rarely served, even to regulars. Its preparation took hours of uninterrupted attention. Its flavor was layered, intense, unapologetic. Some guests pushed it aside after a single bite. Others sat motionless, absorbing it slowly, visibly moved. One critic lowered their fork and whispered, "This isn't for us." The chef heard that too. "That may be true," he replied gently, "but it's not against you." The words shifted something fundamental. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was refusal to pretend that everything must belong to everyone to matter. Tradition, the chef made clear, was not a performance for approval. It was a relationship, one that demanded effort, patience, and humility from those who approached it. By the final course, the room had changed. The energy of expectation had dissolved into reflection. Some guests left early, frustrated and unsettled. Others remained long after the plates were cleared, reluctant to break the stillness. The event that was meant to celebrate the future had instead exposed a fault line running straight through the present. Outside, commentary was already forming. Some would call the night a failure. Others would call it arrogant. But inside the kitchen, the chef felt something rare. Relief. Tradition had not been defended with words or diluted for comfort. It had been allowed to stand on its own, uncompromising, demanding, alive. The question now was not whether tradition could survive the modern world. It was whether the modern world was willing to be challenged by it. And the final act of this night would make that answer impossible to ignore. By the time the final guest stepped into the night, the story had already escaped the dining room. Commentators rushed to define what they had witnessed. Some framed it as elitism. Others called it an unnecessary provocation. A few admitted reluctantly that they had never been challenged so directly by a meal before. The event meant to celebrate heritage had become something far more uncomfortable and far more honest. The following days were turbulent. Articles accused the chef of refusing progress. Cultural panels debated whether tradition had a responsibility to adapt. Sponsors quietly withdrew their interest. Invitations stopped arriving. The restaurant, once useful as a symbol, was now inconvenient as a stance. Tradition, it seemed, was welcome only when it stayed agreeable. But something else was happening beneath the noise. Guests who had stayed, those who leaned into the discomfort, returned. They brought friends. They spoke less and tasted more. The dining room did not grow busier, but it grew steadier. The chef noticed a shift in posture, in silence, in patience. People no longer arrived expecting to be reassured. They arrived prepared to listen. Other kitchens took notice, not loudly, not publicly, but cooks began revisiting methods they had abandoned. They slowed certain processes. They questioned which shortcuts were truly necessary. Tradition was not suddenly revived everywhere, but was no longer dismissed as fragile or outdated. It was recognized as demanding, resilient, and capable of pushing back. Months later, the cultural event was remembered as a failure by organizers. Attendance had dropped in subsequent years. The language softened. The menus became safer. But the night itself refused to disappear. It lived on in conversations that didn't end neatly, in meals that required more patience than people were used to giving. The chef never clarified his intentions. He didn't need to. Tradition had spoken for itself, not as nostalgia, not as decoration, but as a living force that refused to be reduced. It had reminded everyone that some things do not exist to be explained or proved. They exist to be practiced, endured, and respected on their own terms. That night, tradition did not win. It did something more dangerous. It refused to lose quietly. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The